Hello, everyone. My name is Susie Fraser. I'm coordinator of COVA, the Centre of Visual Art at the University of Melbourne. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I live, and I'm speaking to you from today, the Tangarang people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to their elders, past and present, and to extend my respect to all Indigenous people joining us today. So today, as the second live component of this week's online symposium, Event Horizon, we're continuing to mark the launch of the excellent new issue of the journal Art in Australia, also titled Event Horizon, which is available to download on the symposium website. So I'd encourage you all to take a read. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Edward Collis, editor of Art in Australia and lecturer in critical theory at the Victorian College of Arts. And together over the next hour or so, we'll be trying to get some hints and tips on what to do when we approach an event horizon from our distinguished panel of speakers. And I'll just quickly introduce everyone. So Professor Sean Cubitt is Professor of Screen Studies in the University of Melbourne's School of Culture and Communication. Lynette Smith is a Melbourne-based artist and writer who is also contributor to the Event Horizon issue of Art in Australia. Professor Will Steffen is a chemist and emeritus professor at the Australian National University, specializing in Earth system science. Stellark is an internationally celebrated performance artist experimenting with alternative anatomical architectures. And Leon Marvell is associate professor in film and digital media at Deakin University. So a selection of astounding overachievers in their fields. Thank you all for joining us. Ted, would you like to get the conversation started today?
Yeah, certainly. And also just a reminder that if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, possibly the best way to do that is through the chat board. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, in case you're not familiar with the Zoom interface, if you roll down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little icon with like a breakout balloon, which is chat, and you can click on that and you can open a little window on the side and jot in any kind of question you'd like, and we'll keep track of those as the hour goes on. In the meantime, we've got a stellar panel here, a really enjoyable group of people to talk to. We've been having a bit of a chat in the green room prior to this. Our topic is going to be on, I guess, what to do, what to do as the black hole approaches, whether that black hole is metaphoric or whether it's real, or anywhere in between, natural or unnatural. But this morning we spoke a bit about the relationship between creativity in science and research in science. We talked about the leaps of imagination that science can carry out, that perhaps correlative to artistic inspiration and so on, and vice versa, what artists do when they're researching to produce art. Margaret Wertheim, at the end of her talk, not this morning, but the talk on Tuesday, made quite an intriguing remark about, in relation to her hyperbolic crocheting and the negative curvatures of the hyperbola, the hyperbolic curve, I should say. She mentioned how there were instances of hyperbolic curvature and negative curvature in nature, such as, I think she mentioned the sea slug, for instance, and she said the sea slug can make these incredibly complex mathematical forms that really had only been discovered, so to speak, that's to say charted and described in the 19th century in Romanian topology. She said, to see if I can make this without needing to know anything about maths. Now that reminded me of a very famous joke that Barnett Newman once made when he said, aesthetics is to artists as ornithology is to the birds. Presumably meaning birds don't need to study ornithology in order to be birds, right? They have it naturally. They have the capacity innately by being born as birds or being made as birds. They know how to be birds. They don't have to study themselves to do it. And it's of course been a kind of clarion call for a lot of artists who say we don't need to know about art in order to make it. Because it's very different in science. I mean, science, of course, is very, very much about learning what science is, even though it may be pretty indefinite what actually science is, except a method. But I thought I might actually get into the debate by throwing that towards a couple of people. In particular, I think maybe Stellark and Lynette as practicing artists. I know it's not quite on the topic. It's a little bit off message, but I think we might get to the message through this way. But I wonder if either of you could talk to this issue about whether there's such a thing, let's not necessarily call it aesthetics, but whether there's such a thing comparable to ornithology that you feel is part of your practice as art, because both of you have got highly intelligent, informed and discursive, not just frameworks, but kind of matrices out of which your art comes. Lynette, you're nodding. Why don't you take the floor first?
Well, when I think about my career as an artist, I think of it as a constantly developing question of what it means to be an artist. I didn't begin with really any understanding of what that meant, and I came into art almost accidentally. I don't have that in my background at all. I think I first went to an art gallery about 6 months before I got into art school at RMIT. So I look over the course of my working life as an artist and see me constantly working out what it means or what it might mean to be an artist. So I think there is something that one is working out over the course of 20 years, I think very differently now about what it means to be an artist from what I did when I was 20. So there's something to know, there's something to learn. But I also do think that it is probably something that everyone works out for themselves, and the answer to the question is different at different points in history. There is no one thing that it is to be an artist, no one thing that art is over all time and space. What it is that we're doing now, we have to answer different sort of questions, different dilemmas at this point in history compared to others. And I don't know, just to actually pick up the metaphor that I used in my essay about that fold in the surface. It's something artists are always pushing at, that fold. That edge of that fold is constantly, it could be in a different place, and we're working out where that is.
You use, or you draw on René Thom's catastrophe theory. Now, I mean, that's mathematical theory, but it is also a kind of science, a science of prediction as well as, we'll say, prognostication as well as diagnosis, yeah? Do you find that application of science, I mean, particularly as it draws you towards the catastrophic edge, that lip that you've spoken of in your talk for the paper, you know, a catastrophe that is ambiguous, that it is both stabilizing and generative.
Yeah.
Do you feel that that science is the material of your art?
No, I don't actually. My relationship to science is I don't know, ambivalent perhaps. I actually work as a science writer, and I grew up in a religious family. So for me, questions about science are both familiar and strange, and something where there's something riding on it. You know, if you are brought up in a way of life that says the world was created in 6 days, and then you have to suddenly, well, you start to register a different way of looking at the world, there's something riding on it. So I have both a very highly charged relationship to the practice of science, but I also strongly want, as an artist, for what it is to be an artist to be discoverable on its own terms. There are questions about meaning and how we know things, I think, which potentially make for a very interesting discussion with people from a science background. But I don't feel like what I do as an artist is informed, really. There's no subject matter. Yeah, that's it.
Interesting point. Perhaps the science of semiotics would be another field that you would draw on. But that's a very interesting point at the end that you made. Stella, I'm going to turn to you now, because you both seem to have very strong sense of what your subject matter is, and also of the scientific methodologies that you have been bringing into play throughout your career. So tell me a little bit about what science means to you. Particularly, I'm going to push this towards the edge now. Perhaps there's a sense of convulsion that's happening, in your work towards, as you say, the obsolescence of the body, and perhaps the overcoming of bodily limitations in that interface with technology that you've been working on so much in your career. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, I've had a practice where I'm continuously asked if what I do is art, following on from Lynette's ambivalence. And when I was living in Japan in the early 70s, at that time, there was very little work being done in art and technology. In fact, my Japanese artist friends who were practicing monohai, the kind of minimal installation type of artworks using wood and stone and Japanese paper, they would come up to me and they would say, high tech, low art. So there was just no connection between art and science in that regard. Now, in the early 70s, I made these 3 films of the inside of my body. I was using all kinds of medical instrumentation, medical technology to amplify and internally probe my body. So I guess there was always a connection between what we would now call this genre of art and science. On the other hand, I've been very ambivalent being fitted into this kind of category, which I, and perhaps cynically so, associate with an institutional attempt to authenticate artistic practice by having it under the umbrella of research, which connects a little bit to your what you said, Ted, in the first plenary session. So it might be contradictory that I'm not all that clear about how I approach science or engineering. Again, I'm essentially an artist who uses new technologies because they generate new kinds of information and unexpected imagery, but I don't indulge in the methodologies of any kind of scientific practice or methodical research. I mean, I would, without sort of generalizing too much, one could say that science is more about accumulating information and art is more about intuitive impulse. You can make a great artwork overnight. That's not the approach of doing good science, even eccentric science. So there is that ambivalence that I have. On the other hand, science is seductive. New technologies are seductive to artists precisely because they extend our sense of self. They extend our bodily awareness of the world. And on the other hand, what I found is that extruding or extending our experience of sense and self beyond the proximal to the remote and into the virtual generates a kind of an emptiness. And this emptiness is not through a lack, but rather through an excess of the proliferation of instruments, machines, computational systems. In other words, the body is always being outed, externalized, and this kind of sets up a kind of an ontological dilemma and an existential one in the short term. And as I said in my pre-recorded talk, I think the human species has always been within the event horizon of technology. What determines our humanity has always been the production of artifacts, the innovation with instruments and computational systems. So we're already within this kind of event horizon of technology, but I don't think there'll be any kind of singularity. Rather, there'll be a multiplicity of future possibilities. I think a future is not a future if you don't factor in contingency and you don't make it contestable.
Yeah, so you're an optimist then, and humanity does seem to be at stake, indeed, in this obsolescence of human functionality in your own work. Like there is something quite poignant, I should say, about the body that appears in your work, and also the way in which you objectify your own body each time. I think there's very, very rarely have you ever referred to the figure that's in the work as yourself, as your own body. It's always the body, or not always, but generally speaking. But on that issue of say, an optimism about the fate of humanity and the future, might be a point to bring in Will to talk about the catastrophic nature of the Anthropocene and how, as you've pointed out, the disastrous nature of this this era. Do you feel as optimistic as Stellak might?
That's a really good question. I think strangely, I feel more optimistic than my presentations probably indicate. And I think the reason I say that is I think we're at a pretty critical fork in the road now in terms of humanity's arising and existence on the planet. And I say that because I think just as fast as ominous signs are appearing in the rest of the Earth system that things are shifting fast, on the human side, we are developing new ideas, new ways of thinking, new technologies, nascent new social systems at, I think, at an astounding rate. So I think it's a really interesting time to be alive. So the one fork in the road that I talk most about, because I'm a neurosystem scientist, is the more disastrous one. And that has to do with the fact that we are destabilizing our own life support system. And you can measure that in the way I like to measure it is key parts of the Earth system that provide a living environment for us. For example, big ice sheets are melting at an accelerating rate, which is not only raising sea level, it's starting to change ocean circulation, which in effect, which also affects atmospheric circulation. So the whole system is shifting. When you put this together, you can look at a sort of row of dominoes of tipping elements, be they the Amazon forest or the Greenland ice sheet, or ENSO, which affects Australia a lot, and so on. And these things are linked. We know this quite well scientifically. So the one branch of the fork of the road is rather frightening, because we don't know where we start the dominoes really tipping. It could be as early as 2025 or 2030, in which case the Earth system moves out of our control, no matter what we humans think. And it's going to do its own thing, as it has for hundreds of millions and even billions of years. But that other fork in the road is one that I think artists can talk a lot about, philosophers can talk about, technical people, engineers can talk a lot about, because there are massive changes occurring at an accelerating rate on the human side of things. We could start from issues that I look at, like energy systems, and even 5 years ago, talking about going to renewables, electromobility, all of these things were sort of pie in the sky stuff. Now they are advancing at such a rate that they are astounding even economists and technologists. And that's the innate creativity of humans and our ability to work together and generate really exciting new ideas. But then we have the entrenched interests of the past, who don't want to give up their power, their grip on the political system, and so on. So I think we're at one of the most creative, interesting points in human history that this next decade is going to be it. This is the fork in the road. So that's the way I like to look at it. This is why I enjoy interacting with a lot of scholars outside of the natural sciences, because I get a lot of insights into the human side of things, which of course is the critical side of things now at this point.
I'd love to continue, but I know Susie's very keen to ask you a question.
I actually, yeah, it's kind of tying a few things, a few of the current threads together in the chat. So Stellark, you talked a little bit about different methodologies in science and the arts, that you don't subscribe necessarily to scientific methodologies of measurement or repetition, or I suppose, Will, as a chemist, and this also ties into Lynette's presentation, which spoke about humans as not being separate from nature necessarily. You showed, Will, a diagram in your presentation noting the need to incorporate human culture and values and activities into our scientific modeling now to understand how the world is functioning. So I was just wondering, could you quickly go back over that point? Why is it important to include human culture in our scientific studies of the Earth? And do you think it's difficult to quantify human culture using the methodologies of science that you use?
That's a really good question. The first thing, I'll answer the back part of the question first, and that is, I think including human cultures, thinking, ideas, and so on into an Earth system framework, I wouldn't call it a model, because those sort of things you can't model quantitatively, is a real challenge to the natural sciences, because it gets us out of our comfort zone, because we can't shoehorn humans, and particularly collectively, because there are a lot of what we call emergent properties, because humans interact with each other and spin off each other and so on. But basically, I think what you're saying is that for a long time, people in my area of research, natural scientists, have thought of the Earth system as a bunch of non-human things. It's got oceans and atmosphere, and it's got a biosphere, it's got ecosystems, it's got soils, it's got all that, and it's got all the processes that link them, like circulation, like the water cycle, like nitrogen and carbon cycles. But we sort of set humans aside and say, well, we just are there for the ride. But now in the Anthropocene, it's been a jarring, I think, development for the natural sciences as well, to say that humans now are a fully active part of the Earth system at the planetary level for the first time. So we can see, and that's the whole idea of the Anthropocene, is that we can no longer see that the dominant forces driving the trajectory of the Earth system are the great forces of nature, i.e. the incoming solar radiation, ice sheets waxing and waning, circulation, and so on. Now it's humans modifying this through changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, changing the land surface, increasingly changing the ocean directly as well. But that gets us out of our comfort zone, because you cannot mathematize or neatly quantify what humans do like you can in an ice sheet, because it has some pretty simple physics that you can model. And this gets us way out of our comfort zone. But it's also, to me, intriguing, because it forces us to interact with many other types of knowledge generation, many other types of understanding, many other types of viewing this planet we're on and who we are. So to me, it's a very exciting time in knowledge generation, because I think it's really highlighting the importance of what we do, because we understand how the Earth is changing, but also highlighting the limits of what we do in understanding the human side of things.
And Susie, I hate to bring this in, but Marvin Minsky, who's one of the leading kind of AI and robotics pioneers, once unfortunately said that culture is doing bad science, which I don't subscribe to, but I thought that might be interesting from a scientist, another scientist's point of view of the relationship to culture.
Yeah.
But Minsky also said, I don't know if everyone can hear me. Anybody can hear me?
Yes, Will. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Minsky said about 45 years ago in one of his books on AI and the whole idea of artificial intelligence, that there'd be a thinking machine that had, beat the Turing test within about 10 years. So his prognostications have still not come about. So,
yeah. But it's fatal. It's fatal making those kinds of scientific predictions.
That's right. Yes, that's when you know a scientist has really stepped out of their area of expertise. There you go.
Yes.
I guess I'm trying to find a segue here to actually bring Leon in now. I had one a moment ago, but I think it might be something to do with scientists making predictions that don't necessarily come true. I'm going to talk to Leon now about his presentation, which unfortunately, due to a scientific glitch, didn't appear in the program until yesterday. So if you haven't seen Leon's talk, please go to it after this session and have a look. You'll find it very enjoyable, and I'll just give you a little glimpse of what it is. It's a series of messages broadcast from the outer limits of a known universe by an astronaut who appears to be traveling towards an event horizon. I wanted to ask you, Leon, having thought about the scientific prospects of a tipping point, like the bifurcation that can happen in terms of human development, human evolution, whether it's like tipping into the post-human or tipping towards extinction. You're a bit of an expert in science fiction, and I'm wondering if you can bring to the conversation some of your observations about sci-fi in relation to the tipping point and the brink of, the brink of life itself.
Well, that is a huge question, Ted. So I shall...
You're big enough to handle it.
I'll offer a couple of thoughts. Science fiction is a very interesting form of thinking, and I've always regarded science fiction ever since I was quite young. And like most people, I started reading science fiction when I was a teenager. And perhaps like many people, I had no idea what I was throwing myself into, really. I was attracted this is in the 1970s, by the incredibly psychedelic covers of many of British publications of science fiction novels. So I was always interested in visual arts. That's another reason I'm here. So I was attracted to this remarkable imagery. And that's what led me into reading science fiction and then becoming familiar with the canon, etc. And then I stopped reading science fiction when I went to university, and I became a literature snob. So I was reading anything but canonical science fiction, and I was reading, you know, all the sort of things you expect that a university student interested in the humanities and reading. But then, of course, there have been a number of tipping, and the reason I'm telling you this story, this biographical story, is that there are a number of tipping points within the history of this form of thinking that we call science fiction that are significant. And for me, the one that brought me back to really delving into science fiction and appreciating the possibilities of the form was the 1984 publication of Neuromancer by William Gibson. I was, what was I doing that year? I was doing my master's degree, and Mackenzie Walk, some of you of course will know Mackenzie, we're doing the same master's degree together, and Ken, that time, Mackenzie, handed me this book. He said, Leon, you've got to read this book, Neuromancer by William Gibson. And it was all the things that I had thought in my university years that was missing from science fiction, by which I mean science fiction. I've got to make a definition here, genre science fiction. So what's genre science fiction? Genre science fiction is that which most people associate with the idea of science fiction. Those garish covers that I talked about that I discovered in the 1970s, but also a whole bunch of what a number of science fiction writers called the protocols. Samuel Delany calls them the protocols of science fiction. Rudy Rucker calls them the riffs, the science fiction riffs, which are things like alien invasion, artificial intelligence, etc. These are themes that have been worked throughout the literature and indeed the cinema of science fiction over and over again. But what genre science fiction, which we can date from about 1920s with the publication of Amazing Stories, edited by Hugo Gernsback, it was sort of cold-heartedly anti-modernist. So whilst all the great modernist writers were doing their work in the 1920s and 30s and experimenting, literary experiments, visual experiments, experiments in the visual arts, experiments in the cinema, genre science fiction was stuck in this rut, not a rut, but a sort of way that the writers had to comport themselves. So when I discovered Neuromancer, all the stuff that had been missing in science fiction was suddenly there in front of me in this novel by William Gibson. All the sort of modernist tropes, all the concerns that writers had had. Of course, Gibson's big influence was William Burroughs and the 1960s British New Wave science fiction writers. So in terms of tipping points, that was one for me, a personal one. And I think for a lot of people who had been reading science fiction, Neuromancer and the writings and the ideas of what then developed as the cyberpunk movement became very important. I know they're important to you, Ted, for example. We both, you know, threw ourselves into that era of reading the new type of writing that was coming out principally from the United States. But there was a few other tipping points as well. This goes back to something that Will was saying about the Anthropocene. Stan Robinson, in an interview, someone was asking about his Mars series of novels, which of course, if those of you who've read the novels will be familiar with the notion of terraforming Mars and setting up the first human colonies on Mars. And he said that, I think one of the interviewers said, so is this even remotely possible that you could terraform another planet? And Robinson said, well, we've been terraforming the planet Earth for thousands of years since the agricultural revolution. And he's quite right. I was recently in Indonesia, and you just look at the rice, the terraces of the rice paddies there, which have been there for a few thousand years. And we have been terraforming the world. So there's that, science fiction idea that's actually been with us for a long time. But the major tipping point that threw us into the area of fantastic fiction that has become science fiction is something that my friend, and some of you will be familiar with his writing, John Clute, probably the world's most famous science fiction critic. He coined this term fantastica, which is a Czech word, which refers to the non-naturalistic literature that has always been with us, but in particular, the non-naturalistic literature that emerged in the late 18th century, and he relates it to, at this time, the late 18th century, the planet Earth was pretty much being mapped. Before this time, you all know the story and you've seen the reproductions of the maps in medieval times or Renaissance times. Here there be monsters. Where the unmapped territory was, that was the unknown, that was the monstrous, possibly the monstrous. But in the late 18th century, the world had been mapped, and there was a realization amongst artists, intellectuals, writers, that something was going wrong with the world. And the literature of the fantastic is a response to, without mincing words, the pain and the horror of the recognition of things that were going wrong with the world. And as a number of you, of course, we're all committed in various ways to this notion, realize we're now also aware, increasingly aware, horribly aware of the pain and the pain of the world, the pain of the planet Earth. So I think that one of the interesting things about science fiction is that if we take John Clute's ideas on board, that in the late 18th century, there was a mapping of the world, there was a recognition that with this understanding, a greater understanding of the world, there was a recognition of big problems associated with it. We're now at this mirrored point, I think, in time, where we're all aware of the tipping point. Will, you said something interesting when you made the analogy with the domino effect. And I always think of Laplace and Laplace's famous statement that, you know, when he got to a billiard table and he hit that white ball, if he knew every single force that it was acting, because he was, you know, mathematical scientist, and he could calculate them all, he could tell you all in that instant where each one of those balls would end up on the table. You know, we now know that's impossible because of complexity theory and etc. But there was that certainty, certainty of being in control of forces of nature, and of having mapped the world. And now that's all. Well, I guess we've come to the end of that era of thinking, haven't we? We no longer think that everything can be mapped. We no longer think that we no longer think that everything is calculable. And an intervention in that quickly fading illusion, I think, has been much the writing in science fiction. It's also why Ted knows this, and some of my students know this, why I'm sort of appalled at what people call science fiction films, because very few of them can match up to some of the ideas and some of the writing by the best thinkers in science fiction literature. Anyway,
I'll just step in there. I'm going to use all this as a segue to pitch towards Sean now. But just before I do that, I'll just mention that Margaret Wertheim and I had a very good-natured tiff in the last session about our estimates of the movie Event Horizon itself. Afterwards, she did point out to me that it's actually a profoundly Catholic film. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. I took it as Lovecraftian Satanism, but who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, they match. But
I think we're going to have to publish that little snippet of your conversation with Margaret on the website. It was great.
Well, I'll edit that down. But it gives me the chance now to turn to Sean, and I'm going to keep the sci-fi theme running here for a moment because, Sean, your cosmic zoom, as you described it in the talk, that I have to say, quite fascinating novel understanding of the EHT image as a zoom at 55 million light years in accomplishment, and comparing that to the famous Eames film, Powers of 10. Absolutely fascinating. There are two things that I wanted to ask you about. One was a phrase where you, towards the end of the talk, where you said that, it may not have been your own words. You may have been, I think, inciting someone else or citing someone else, but very powerful. It worked in terms of what you were saying, that cosmic images lead us to ponder a posthumous universe. Say a universe is beyond our own lifespan and beyond our even the extinction of the species itself. And yet you said at the end, although death seems to hang in the fabric of this image of the EHT, I think you said it was an image of hope. An image of hope. Now, I'm just going to add to this before I turn you on. The scene at the end. Oh, sorry, that was. Pardon me. The scene at the end of the sci-fi movie, The Incredible Shrinking Man, has something that's almost like what you were talking about, and that's the zoom out as he goes down to a almost atomic level. After he's fought that huge spider, and the zoom comes out to a nebula. Yeah. Zooms out, right?
It's so funny. I've just been writing about that.
That's horrifying, image. I mean, it's meant to be consoling and humanist, but it is actually like the end of everything, isn't it? The end of the Invisible Shrinking Man. Oh, sorry, the Incredible Shrinking Man.
Well, it's another incredibly Catholic movie, or certainly Christian one, as he disappears and he speaks in voiceover at this juncture, and he says, even as I was disappearing into that last void between the atoms, I thought, God will know I exist. And that's when the swelling music comes in, and these kind of, I think, Palomar images, literally telescope images rather than the radio telescopy of the others. Yeah, I've been writing about that in the continuation of that thing on the cosmic zoom, and contrasting it with Fantastic Voyage, which is the ghastly 1960s movie with Raquel Welch, where they miniaturize a military submarine and send it into a bloodstream to rescue a dying military scientist. Yes. And they are magically popped back up to their original size, undamaged and unharmed. Which I think is kind of interesting, because it does suggest a couple of things. One I just couldn't resist about the birds and not needing ornithology. That's almost certainly true. Birds seem to have an instinctive knowledge about how to be birds. Unfortunately, human beings do not demonstrate any instinctive knowledge about how to be human. And I would suggest that we do require the humanities and social sciences, which Dan Tehan is so intriguingly opposed to at present, in order to find out how to be human. One of the interesting things about that, in relation to what Will was saying earlier, is that it's taken the humanities and social sciences until really the 1980s to begin to take account of the fact that it's not just about human beings, and that we need to actually look at the non-human. I think Donna Haraway's essay was 1984 as well, I think, her famous essay about the cyborg, and then the work on environmentalism that had begun with Rachel Carson Silent Spring, not Rachel, yeah, you know who I mean, with Silent Spring in the 60s.
That was Rachel Carson.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and then there's Gary Snyder's work and so forth that had such a huge impact on us. I think one of the intriguing things is that, oddly, although you're obviously systems, Earth systems and ecological science had for a long time been absolutely invested in the non-human, and was surprised to find itself having to deal with the human. For many of the other sciences, they had a very parallel obsession with the human use of whatever it was they were studying. And that there was, I think, an unquestioning instrumentalism. And what's intriguing about the art science interplay is that not only is there no one art, but there's no one science. and the multiplicity there, you know, from genomics to hydrography. There's really, you know, there's not a great deal to discuss, except that what I think the humanities and the art, sort of humanities art science nexus brings is a question that I think is central to humanities, which is, how are we supposed to live? And the we is the thing that's changed. And I think it's also changed for the sciences. It's no longer implicit that science is good if it makes money, or if it suppresses or controls some aspect of nature. The question is much more about how are we, human and non-human, supposed to do anything useful. So I would have a kind of counter question almost to yours. And it's in a way also to disagree with Leon when you were saying there that we no longer think everything is calculable. Yeah, you and I and most of the people in this chat room, I think, would agree with that. But I think their dominant ideology of the early 21st century is precisely that everything is calculable, that the economic system is based on the principle that you can calculate your way out of a global financial crisis, which is the other event horizon we've kind of forgotten about because it's kind of buried underneath all the rest of the crap that's going on. Yes. But you know, if we'd been having this meeting 5 years ago, financial crisis would have been the event horizon. So on the one hand, it's that kind of neoliberal economics. On the other, I think that when the ruling class rules, when the dominators dominate, they have a tendency to use a mathematical theory of communication that came out in 1949, first order cybernetics about self-equilibrating systems. And there's a deep faith that those systems are self-calculating, self-equilibrating, and that, like the market, we can trust the planetary ecology to sort itself out. And I think we need a far, far more critical, that is to say, crisis-driven understanding of what our systems are. I don't think we do understand complexity, or that our masters do. I don't mean that it's dominant ideology in the sense that we all believe it. I mean, this is the ideology that people use in order to dominate. And that's where I think an alliance of the arts and sciences is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, Sean, I think something that was coming out from all of your presentations was trying to reveal the complexities of things that we think are straightforward. So we think the human sight functioning or looking in a way that reflects a zoom or a movement that becomes instinctive, and we assume that's how we view things as humans. But in fact, you're taking us through the emergence of the zoom for the human. In your presentation revealed that kind of hidden complexity. And I think with Lynette's presentation, when you were discussing how our images, in relation to the EHT image making, that our images that we put out into the world become co-opted. The things we make become co-opted and used kind of to keep us in our place and to organize us through kind of neoliberal economics and that kind of thing. Sorry, Will, were you going to say something related to what Sean was saying?
Yeah, I just wanted to say very, very quickly, I think those are some really good insights, and the comments, for example, about neoliberal economics are spot on. From a Earth system science, a complex system point of view, they're decades behind the thinking of how systems really work. It's reductionist, it's often cause-effect, very simplistic, and it completely ignores the fact that there are breakpoints, tipping points, nonlinear dynamic changes in systems. I think we're going through one now, and the economic system will have no credible answer for, I think, coming out of the COVID-19 crisis.
The other thing to take into account as well, and kind of obliquely referring to Sean's Zoom idea, is this issue where there's always a slippage between intention and actual outcome. So we always have to be flexible and to take into account accidental occurrences, unexpected events. So we can't be completely deterministic in a human world where contingency is always going to be a factor and slippage is always occurring between intention and outcome.
Well, just a response to Will for a moment, and to say, you know, we did feel that after 2008, the global capitalist system would have to actually undergo some drastic change to accommodate, you know, the disaster that happened there. If it did change, it actually got stronger. It kind of defied what the expectations were as a result of that, and so I agree entirely that, you know, this situation now is an example of a non-linear convulsion, you know, that's happening. But, you know, in a funny way, I just go back to a remark that Leon made about Laplace and the mathematical predictability of everything in the universe. And I remember he said, I think it was his famous phrase where he said, "I have no place for God in the calculation anymore." Because when you know, when the calculability of the world starts to collapse, that's precisely when metaphysical or transcendent concepts of universality start to resurge. You know, and I wonder whether something like that might well come out of this situation that we're in. Not to sound Catholic or too much Catholic anyway. We don't have any swelling music behind us anyway. I actually noticed, I just wanted to very quickly allude to this, and that's, I noticed that Rex Butler's in the audience here, and if anyone has watched his presentation on for this session, you'll identify a number of rather critical and kind of extreme I think almost post-humanist comments. I wonder if Rex would like to come in. If you're with us and you want to.
Sure. I mean, I won't. I mean, well, if anyone's heard the thing on Baudrillard, he has this kind of very clever idea that a system's limits don't occur at its end, but at every point of it, and that the system, in effect, is its own limit. And it'd be very interesting to hear someone who knows about astronomy to think about this. But it seems to me a beautiful exemplar of that is the idea of an expanding universe. And we think the universe is expanding, and we find that a kind of emblem of everything about human civilization. But in a way, you know, even for a layperson, it's not really expanding because it's only filling the space that's growing up with it. It just is the same. You know, the universe is always trying to fill a space that in some strange way precedes it. It's a kind of cyclical process. It's not actually getting bigger because how can it be? Because it still hasn't filled the space that comes with it. And, you know, I won't go on too long, but, you know, one of the very brilliant things about compares the kind of limits of our culture with our so-called primitive cultures with their symbolic exchange, and the idea that in a, quote, primitive society, a primitive society understands very well that it is its own limit. It is cyclical. It doesn't get bigger. It effectively stays the same. And one of Baudrillard's very challenging hypotheses is that for all of this so-called expansion of Western civilization and the kind of satisfaction of our needs, wants, desires with consumerism, the same, I mean, I'm humanizing him here, but the same limits, lacks, necessities still remain. We haven't solved any of our problems. We are still exactly in the same situation that we started with. And that seems an incredibly brilliant hypothesis, in fact, that the last 300 years of Western civilization have produced no progress at all because we're exactly in the same situation we started with. And it's a lovely, challenging idea, I think.
The implication of what you were saying in the talk is that there is no way to turn back, and there seems to be no way to change our direction either. That you know, humanity is its own limit. Humanity was living in the co-presence of death all the time.
I agree, and it's sort of, you know, in a way, the catastrophe has always been. You know, it's not going to happen. We can't defer it. It's already happened. I mean, Western civilization was its own catastrophe, was its own end from the beginning. That's what allowed it to expand so much. And I think an astronomer would know this, it's like the Big Bang. You know, a catastrophe allowed the universe to expand forever. But in effect, if you imagine what is it expanding into, it's only just filling a space. It's no bigger. It still hasn't filled it yet, right? It hasn't got to its limit. And that's, I think, a beautiful metaphor for us, that we haven't filled anything. There's still exactly the same gap as there was in the beginning. It's a nice idea, I think.
I want to add something there. I wrote and spoke about how catastrophe, the event of catastrophe, is actually necessary for life. Life depends on catastrophes, an event of a catastrophic kind. That was Tom's theory of the catastrophe. I know this has got metaphorical dimensions, but I have found it a really something quite rich with possibilities to think about this notion of the catastrophic event as actually life forming, necessary for living systems, the production and reproduction of life. And I think that this is where continuity comes from. So things destabilize, you know. So Will talks, for instance, we've all talked about how we're doing things that destabilize the planetary systems, but the planet will go on. It'll just go on in a way that is unsatisfactory for us. So it's catastrophic in a metaphorical sense for us, but it's a catastrophe that allows the planet to still remain a living system. So I think that's an interesting distinction to make. And in thinking through that, it forced me to make a distinction between the image, that catastrophic event, which is an involuntary thing, and these acts that we can do, which I've called pictures and picturing, which I think it's a bit much to go into right now, but they're a very different. I think there's an interesting the interest in the contrast is that when it comes to the pictures and the artifacts and things that we make, then we can make some decisions about what we will do and be, what sort of conditions of life we will choose to make for ourselves, in which those images, those involuntary events happen. I'm not sure if that's too abstract.
Lynette, I was talking to, as part of a podcast that we're recording to go along with the symposium, which will be released soon. But yeah, I was talking to Peter Gallison, who is based at Harvard and was involved in the EHT image, the making of the image. He came in later in the project to try and get the image together. And a throwaway comment of the decision making that went into the image of, he said, we had a debate as a group on whether to color the image blue or red. And then they had a tussle about the cultural associations of the two colors. Well, blue is the hottest color, but in fact, the cultural associations are red. So let's go with that. And what I loved about that was this thing that we take for granted as being such a straightforward scientific thing actually was imbued with all this complexity of culture, decision making. Who are we? What are we?
Yeah.
To amplify that point, I had a conversation with Bruce Sterling, of all people, a couple of years ago at a symposium, and we were talking about the Hubble telescope images, which you're all familiar with. And I pointed out that there was a time in the early 80s when science fiction cinema, the starscape changed irrevocably. before that period, before the Hubble telescope images became publicly disseminated, a starscape was a black field with white twinkling stars. Then in a number of films, suddenly there was these multicolored rainbow hued star fields through which the spaceships, of course, traveled. This is entirely a result of the images of the Hubble telescope being sent back. And Sterling and I were discussing this fact. And then he was talking about the images, and I said, but hang on, I've got my children gesturing at me for some bizarre reason. We're talking about these colorful images of the Eagle Nebula, etc. And I said, well, of course, there's no color there whatsoever. All that color was chosen by the scientists and aestheticians back here on Earth. All they got was streams and streams of data, which they had to make sense of it and resolve that data, those numbers, into some sort of visual imagery, and then decide what hues, what intensities, what contrasts would be within where that data set. So again, it's a sort of catastrophe in a way, and it's a human outreach, if you like, to these images. They're unknowable. The data that comes back that's out there beyond the Hubble telescope, that was all created back here. I think that great outside is still far and far away. I don't know if we're going to fill that space. Who knows?
Beyond our optical spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, one of the terrifying things about the one particular instrument on the Hubble, they had a photon counter for particularly faint objects. So the faint object camera just gathers individual photons, mostly smeared out because they've been traveling so long for such cosmic distances. But in order to gather the data, they obviously have to erase the photon and convert it into telemetry that they can beam back to Earth. So the images there, some of them, especially the most distant objects, are actually the last memento of some incredibly precious, insanely ancient light that we took out of the sky and deprived the rest of the universe of forever.
Yes.
So that is part of my response, or one element of my response to your initial question about the posthumous universe. I'm sure I have stolen the phrase from somewhere, I just can't remember where, but then, as the poet Ezra Pound said, that's what culture is. It remains when you've forgotten which book you stole it from. So I think that idea that the universe is going to persist, the planet will persist, the universe will persist. For those of us who are completely secular, that is a really serious grounds for hope. And that the function of hope, and why I wanted to use that word in particular as opposed to something else, is that it belongs to a mid-20th century group of particularly pessimistic philosophers, amongst them Ernst Bloch, who I know Leon, writer on utopias, but he oddly got together with Theodor Adorno, another immensely depressed philosopher, and they agreed together on only one thing, that hope is only a virtue because it can be disappointed. If you knew that it was all going to turn out fine, there would be no purpose to hope. And of course, this is the period of 5-year plans. So this is the kind of area that, oh, I'm getting a weird the period of the 5-year plans in Stalinist East Germany, where Bloch was based. That was an era in which you could plan the future, and therefore the future could never exist because it could never be disappointed because Stalin said so. Hope is this other thing that you take on as an obligation because there isn't any other option.
In relation to the planet's survival beyond us and being a hopeful sign, I'll just mention remark that I had an oceanographer, young award-winning oceanographer, write for Art in Australia a little while ago. I asked him to think about his studies in ocean currents, deep ocean currents, as a work of art, and what would he come up with? And he came up with this exquisite formula to describe it. And he said, unfortunately, one of the consequences of this formula is that it indicates that the Earth's shape is actually changing, and that it's kind of being squeezed at the poles, and it will change into a different shape, which will radically alter the atmosphere and everything else on Earth. And I said, that sounds pretty scary. And he said, oh, nothing to worry about. He said, human race will be gone well before that happens. The planet will be fine. The planet will be fine. As you can tell, for everyone who's still there, and it looks like we've held a good audience throughout. Thanks very much for that. As you can tell, we could keep having this conversation for another hour, and it'd be really lovely to do that. But unfortunately, I know we have to finish here. I'm going to suggest that anyone who has not been following the chat should actually go to the chat column, because it's got some really lovely comments in it and exchanges between members of the audience as well. And thank you very much for doing all that. I'm going to save the chat, so I recommend that everyone else do that as well. It's very enjoyable. I would love this conversation to continue, and maybe it can in another virtual form beyond this. I'm sure Susie and I will have further to discuss with that.
Yeah, I think I have like 12 or 15 more immediate questions for everyone, but good idea, Ted, to hold those over maybe for another chat.
I think I'll just conclude with a very, very personal remark, and that is that the image of the Event Horizon has been holding my focus and attention for a year, and I still feel I haven't got close to its mystery, because I think that is one of the great things about it. You can watch Katie Bowen's fantastic talk at Caltech, which we've been able to get, where she describes how that image is produced, and it's remarkable, a remarkable piece of ingenuity as well as inspiration. But just the other day, I think I experienced my own Event Horizon image when I experienced a migraine aura that was unaccountable. I'd never experienced anything like it before, and I was on the phone to my daughter, trying to describe this, in between waves of nausea. And she said, and I could hear her tapping away as I was doing the description. She pulled up a Google image search for me that had exactly that aura. Someone else had experienced this thing, right? So the utter subjectivity and isolation of that sensation, you suddenly were aware someone else had it, and they had communicated it into the void. It had come like one of Leon's messages from the outer limits back to Earth that had come back to me. And I did feel some hope for that, I must say. Sorry, Lynn.
I just said a picture. They pictured it for you.
Indeed, it was pictured for me, and I think being able to picture that strangeness and alienness is a fantastic thing that human beings have been able to do. Susie, why don't you round off the whole session for us with a few comments about COVA and what we might be doing in the future.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ted. So again, thanks to everyone in the audience as well as on the panel. This is one component of the Event Horizon Symposium. So I encourage you all to kind of go and explore the content and have a bit of a listen to some of the presentations you might not have heard. And also to, as I said, take a look at the Art in Australia issue, Event Horizon, which is jam-packed full of other content. And yeah, we'll keep adding to the website. We're really hoping to expand more discussion in this area. And I think I'm getting lots of PMs as well of saying they have lots more questions. So we can just find different platforms and different forums to get all of us back together to continue these really important discussions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye all.
Yeah. Bye.
Did the panel want to stay on for